Hey, well, welcome back, everybody, to the Housing Crack. This is the second session, Lessons Learned from Housing Academy. Today, we have as presenters Sarah Reitzman, the Community Engagement Coordinator with New Hampshire Housing, George Regan, the Community Engagement Manager with New Hampshire Housing, Judy Barrett, Founding Principal and Managing Director with Barrett Planning Group, and Corinne Marco, the administrative assistant and board clerk for the ZBA, for the Zoning Board of Adjustment with the City of Keene. Just want to go over a couple of logistics about meeting controls. The meeting controls are located in the ribbon located at the top of your screen as depicted on this slide. You should see icons to raise your hand, to open the chat box, to react, and to change the screen view according to your preferences. If you have a question during the session, please put it in the chat box and we will try to have the speakers do their best to answer them. If there's a good kind of breaking point, we'll also have time at the end of the presentation for additional questions and answers. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speakers, George and Sarah.
Thank you very much, Noah, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. Noah, thanks for introducing all of our guests, but I just want to put a special sort of thank you out there to Judy and Corinne for agreeing to be part of this presentation. And Sarah, she had to be, and we wanted to be. So we're happy to talk about the Lessons Learned from Housing Academy, which is part of the Invest in NH Municipal Planning and Zoning Grant Program. But first, just a little bit about New Hampshire Housing. You see our mission statement up there to promote, finance, and support housing solutions for the people of New Hampshire. And we've been around since 1981. And again, just for those folks that don't know, we're not a state agency. We're a self-funded organization. The tie back to the state is through our board of directors that are appointed by the governor and council. And just some things about what we do. Many of you may know we have home ownership programs, so help promoting first-time home buyers, successful home ownership. Since we've been around, about 50,000 people have purchased their home through our programs, and about 1,300 people last year. We help finance multifamily development throughout the state, and finance about 1,800 units on the last year, and about lots of other federal programs, including the Housing Choice Voucher program that helps provide stable rent for over 9,000 residents in New Hampshire. So those are just some of our programs, just so you know a little bit about us. And wanted to now kind of get into what we're here to talk about, and that's the Invest in NH Municipal Planning and Zoning Grants, more specifically what we've learned from Housing Academy. And for those that don't know, it's part of Governor Sununu's $100 million Invest NH initiative, and that was money that came from the 2021 American Rescue Plan Act. So there was a lot of money that went there. There was of that 100 million, there was a 60 million. There is a $60 million capital subsidy program, a $30 million municipal per unit grant program, a $5 million municipal demolition grant program, and then the $5 million that's for our planning and zoning grants. And one of the things that we're happy to be a part of this, when we started thinking, that's we New Hampshire Housing, through the Department of Business and Economic Affairs, which is really where this ARP funds come through. We started learning that there was a possibility there might be some money tied to planning and zoning grants. We were really thrilled because for those that might remember, back in 2014, we closed out $1 million community planning grant. And that wasn't all for housing, it was for a lot of things, but it was the work with municipalities. And one of the big takeaways from that was the importance of community engagement, that if we want to look for change in our communities, we need to look in amongst ourselves and talk with each other and sort of have a balanced and inclusive conversation. And so that was sort of baked into an opportunity of, well, why don't we focus some money on housing related issues. So we partnered with Plan New Hampshire, who's also a partner in this endeavor as well. So we started this municipal technical assistance grant program, which was designed to give technical assistance money to communities to to work on housing-friendly ordinances. And through that process, we learned a lot. We learned that some communities aren't ready maybe to go forward with that, but do we want to put some money behind the conversation? And so as this grant program came, we had the foundation to really develop something. And so it's really exciting to have this $5 million program that includes housing opportunity planning grants, which Sarah's going to talk about, as well as community housing navigator grants that were really designed, both of which are designed to have community engagement at the forefront, but recognize that communities are at different places, and we have to sort of, as my board member says, change happens at the speed of trust. And so I think that foundation of this is, how do we provide technical resources and assistance at the speed in which a community is working at to try to talk about and address their housing issues. So I'm excited that we're a part of that. Sarah and I and lots of other people are Plan New Hampshire partners, along with UNH Cooperative Extension that was a partner and is still a partner currently in this program, helping to provide the community engagement part and deliver the curriculum on the Housing Academy. It's just great to be a part of that, and really to have so many communities that are interested in getting technical assistance to do some elements of or address some elements of housing in their communities. So with that, I will turn this over to Sarah to give you more detail about this grant program.
Great. Thanks, George. Good morning, everyone. So we're largely talking today about the Housing Opportunity Planning Grants. Those are our HOP grants. The City of Keene and the town of Plymouth were both awarded HOP grants. So that's largely what we're talking with. But I wanted to at least include sort of an overview of the Community Housing Navigator grants. That was the other grant program that we used that Invest NH money to sort of create. So we gave away $1.2 million. These were municipal grants to grow staff capacity to coordinate activities related to housing. When we first came up with this grant program, we were picturing a community. And so think of Portsmouth and Dover, who both have community housing navigators working with them now, getting funding specifically to hiring a human who's working for the city, for the municipality, maybe in the planning department, maybe somewhere else, but working on all activities related to housing with a focus on sort of community organizing, community engagement around housing conversations. So that was the sort of fundamental purpose of this Navigator grant program. We awarded 5 grants last October. And those folks, those community housing navigators, are working in 12 communities. So I mentioned the city of Dover has a community housing navigator, the city of Portsmouth, and then the other 3 grants were awarded to our regional planning commissions to work with some specific communities. So Southwest RPC applied for, and they have a community housing navigator who's working in Chesterfield, Fitzwilliam, Hinsdale, and Winchester. Stratford Regional Planning Commission has a navigator who's working in Farmington and New Durham, and Upper Valley Lake Sunapee has a housing navigator who's working in New London, Newbury, Sunapee, and Wilmette. So that's a 2-year position. There'll be the funding, we have to obligate or expend it all by the end of next September. And so we'll see like what these individuals are able to accomplish in those specific communities, push forward not just housing conversations, community engagement around housing, but also some regulatory change. So we're really excited about this program because George and I recognize, and many of you are probably familiar with like the workforce housing coalitions around the state, that like having those individuals at the local level doing this sort of grassroots community engagement work and connecting with individuals about housing is just, it's key to solving our housing crisis. And then the other part of this money we used and created the Housing Opportunity Planning Grant, so HOP grants. We have over $3 million available. These are municipal grants for municipalities to hire consultants to work on 3 phases of regulatory change. And we'll talk about what those are, and conduct community engagement activities. And so we made community engagement a requirement of all of our grant programs because we know how important it is for actually making these changes, is doing this good community engagement work. So municipalities could apply for more than 1 phase at a time. They could skip phases, and we have communities that are sort of all over the map, and we'll talk about what those phases are. There is still money available here. We are still accepting applications. We approve them on a rolling basis, usually like within a month of submission. And the 3 phases have staggered deadlines, so we'll talk about those. So the first phase was needs analysis and planning. We gave out grants of up to $25,000 to communities to do things like update the housing chapter of their master plan, or do like a local housing needs assessment, sort of complementary to the regional housing needs assessments, and look at their housing market affordability. Deadline for this was January. So these grants are no longer available, but phase 2 and phase 3 grants are. So that's up to $50,000 for a regulatory audit. That's a phase 2 grant. So looking at the regulatory barriers in your community, and those applications are due at the end of June. And then last one, phase 3, regulatory development. So up to $100,000 to create or amend regulations. Again, that's municipalities hiring consultants to do this work. And I see by looking at the attendees in the chat that there's some folks here who have received sort of various, we've had communities who just applied for 2 and 3, who applied for 1, 2, and 3. We had communities who applied for just phase 3. They already know what they want to do. We had a lot of communities apply for just phases 1 and 2. So there's a lot of options here, a lot of ways that you could sort of customize what you wanted to do, depending on where your community was at. So we have given out 47 HOP grants. $2.3 million have been granted already. That's 57 discrete communities being served. There's a little bit of overlap between the Navigator program. So there are a couple communities that have a Navigator grant that also have a HOP grant. And like I said, it's all over the place. So 16 communities have a phase 1 grant only. 14 communities have a phase 1 and phase 2. So they combine those 2 and they can come back for a phase 3 if they're ready and they get there. 11 communities got all 3 phases. 4 communities applied for just phase 3 grants. So those are communities that are already on their way. They know what they want to do. They know what regulations they want to develop in. So we have this map of grantees, and Noah mentioned that you have access to all these slides, so you can check this out. The little yellow ones are all our navigators. The green ones are all the HOP grants. So this has been really fun to sort of keep track of. It's all over the state. Every county, every region of the state is represented. And there's more information about these, particularly, like I said, there's money remaining. So if there are communities out there that still want to apply for one of these, maybe you want to do a regulatory audit, maybe you want to do some regulatory development, there's still money available. And so you can find the application information on that website. And you can always reach out to George and I, and we'll connect you with the rest of the steering committee. We're administering this grant program with our friends at Plan New Hampshire. And so we've been sort of tackling all of those questions. And then I mentioned community engagement. It's super important piece of every grant project, and that's sort of largely what we want to talk about today and show some examples. So we partnered with UNH Cooperative Extension to create Housing Academy, and this is quite literally training for municipalities that receive any of these grants to learn. It's a bit about housing. There's a lot of housing training in there, housing education, but also to learn some community engagement tools so that they can shape their community engagement plan, their public participation plan, bring that back to their community, and their grant program will be more successful. So these have been interactive, in-person, virtual, place-based training. So we're going to do some community visits in the fall. We have some ideas for sort of extending training opportunities. The sort of first class of Housing Academy, the folks who started in January, just wrapped up Housing Academy at the end of April. So they went through their 5 sessions and learned from the folks at UNH Cooperative Extension. We brought in, speakers from other organizations to talk about community engagement tools and housing sort of topics. So we've gotten really good feedback on this. And so we're talking about like, how do we do more with it? How do we do more of it? Because we really see it as being an incredibly valuable resource to communities who they might not know how to do community engagement. They might not have the resources or the capacity to do community engagement. And so helping them work through all of those issues at the local level. So I mentioned Winter Housing Academy wrapped up last week. They did 5 sessions. 3 of them were virtual, 2 of them were in person. We like this mixture. It seemed like the attendees largely liked this mix of there are benefits of being in person, there are benefits of being virtual. So we did a little of both. There were presentations on dealing with conflict, about how to talk about housing data, what housing can look like, all kinds of topics. And then we actually demonstrated and taught community engagement tools. So we didn't just talk about how to implement community engagement, but we also used them. We practiced what we preach and had people do things like let's do sticky dot, posters, sticky dot voting. Let's do Zoom polls. Let's try some of these like technology tools like the Poll Everywhere, where you text in your answers and you can see it in real time. So a nice combination of digital, in person. We did some like small group session things. We talked about things like key informant interviews and had folks practice them. So this was a way to support grantees as they create their community engagement strategies. Our hope, again, is that this will mean that their projects are more successful as a result of their sort of enhanced ability to engage their communities. And then I'm going to turn it over pretty soon to Corinne and Judy. Like, we have Keene and Plymouth here represented today to talk about what's happening in their community. A reminder that all of these communities are still pretty early on in their process. There are a few exceptions that are sort of way ahead of the game. They're wrapping up phases, or they're getting done with their tasks or deliverables that are on their timelines, and that's awesome. But a lot of these communities are still just getting started. So in a way, it's almost too early to talk about the great case studies from the HOP grants and the Navigator grants, but we wanted to showcase some of the work that's already happening. So Plymouth is doing great stuff, Keene is doing great stuff, and so we wanted an opportunity to tell you about what is happening so that either you're inspired to do the same thing, or you can learn some lessons of like what didn't work, what didn't go well, or what went great, what works really well. But before that, I just wanted to mention, I often joke, my favorite sort of joke about New Hampshire housing, we have a guide for that. Seems like New Hampshire Housing has a guide for everything. And it's true, because our research, engagement, and policy sort of team is always working on putting resources together for municipalities. If you ever have a question, if you ever are looking for a resource, we are truly a fantastic source to start with. We'll point you in the right direction. So our new statewide housing needs assessment is out. There's a link to that. We also have our latest housing market snapshot from March. Our annual residential rental cost survey is underway. You can check out the survey from 2022. The next one will be out this summer, the 2023 residential rental cost survey. So that's where we get a lot of our like great rich housing, rental housing data. We have a great guide, very relevant to this session. How do we talk about housing? It's a guide to community engagement and grassroots advocacy. This is quite literally a step-by-step, it's a 9-step guide to how to have conversations about housing and make this sort of like local movements push housing solutions forward. And that's really fantastic, because truly it's about sort of building relationships and building sort of mini coalitions, grassroots local coalitions of a few people who just, they want to tackle this issue in their community. We have a guide on housing commissions in New Hampshire. So we talk a little bit in this about, it's not just housing commissions, it's housing committees, task force, whatever you want to call them. We love this idea of having like a committee or a commission that's working on pushing these conversations forward and really sustaining it, so you don't lose that momentum. And then we have tons of conferences and webinars. We have a webinar coming up on May 11th about accessory dwelling units. So I link to sort of the events page on New Hampshire Housing's website, because we have quite a few things coming up. And then Housing Factor Fiction, a link to that, because that's a video series that we're doing with Jay Childs, who's the documentarian behind Communities of Consequences, which some of you might be familiar with, that we're looking at sort of the myths around workforce housing. So the first episode is out. You will recognize the narrator, that's me, and it's about sort of who lives in workforce housing. So right now we're putting together sort of a mini episode that's about what workforce housing is, helping to sort of clear up and debunk what's the definition of workforce housing. And then the next one's going to be looking at our sort of favorite myth, if we can choose a favorite, about housing in New Hampshire, which is the relationship between housing development, school enrollment, and the influence that has on property taxes. So it's a very fun one. And I think my last slide is just mine and George's contact information. We can throw that in the chat too, and you can always access these slides. And I'm going to turn it over. Go ahead, George.
I just want to add to the and more part, like just oil and more. Just Sarah mentioned the ADU webinar. I know I was at the last half of the first session this morning with John and Maggie Randolph, and there was a question about tax neutral things, and it made me think of a study we did a while back with Joe Minicosi and Urban 3 that touches on the value per acre. certain types of development. And so I just wanted to put that out there. We just finished a phase 2, which is kind of cost of development, but I know Chris Parker was talking a bit about that at the earlier session that I know many of you were on. But that value per acre is an interesting look at what is the most potent and productive in terms of revenue in a community, and kind of equalizes it by doing it on a per acre basis. Sarah mentioned the housing and school enrollment study. Lots of times, again, there's a real concern about costs. So that school enrollment study will be coming out, as she said, and there will be an actual report from that after that ADU webinar on May 11th. It's really trying to look at successful practices across the country of how we get some kind of incremental solution, to our housing problem that seems to fit well in our rural character, yet it's really hard to do because you need equity, you need money to do it, and it's a real barrier. And sometimes just local land use regulations can be a barrier unto itself. And then finally, which is not one of our products, but there was a talk about water and sewer. And if you lack it, how do you develop? And there was some suggestions about DES's, innovative programs. But I wanted to put out there, it's not yet in the public domain, but those that wouldn't mind traveling to Lee, New Hampshire in June, the Seacoast the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast is going to put on a short conference on how you deal with water and sewer in communities that don't have that kind of public infrastructure. And I know that's always of interesting conversation and very valuable. So that you can find, there isn't information out yet, but that's the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast and Nick Taylor. You can always talk to Sarah and I, and we can loop you in for that event if you're interested. All right, and with that, I'm done. I just wanted to add those few things.
That was great. No, I told you we have a guide for everything. It's hard to cover them all. All right, so we're going to pass it over to Judy.
Super. So thank you. That was really excellent. And I have to tell everybody, I brag about your housing academy all over the place. I was in a meeting in another state yesterday, and I said, you really have to look at what New Hampshire is doing, because it's, as one who works in several states, I actually find this academy particularly impressive and very helpful, and certainly something I can relate to as a consultant. So just a couple of words about me. I'm a planning consultant. I have a small firm in Massachusetts. We work pretty much all over the Northeast. So I've seen kind of how housing practices happen in a variety of other states. It's fun for me to be back working in New Hampshire again, since that is my home state. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Housing Academy. I'm just sort of going to thread it in and out of my presentation, but I also just want to share some of my own lessons learned from 30 plus years in this field about, why housing education and capacity building resources like the Housing Academy are just so very important. So when I think about trying to engage our residents in learning and supporting more housing options in our communities, there are things that I think we all need to keep in mind. People come to housing policy from many different types of backgrounds and experiences, and sometimes with housing problems of their own, and sometimes with a lot of misinformation or just simply no information, which again is the beauty of programs like the Housing Academy, because it gives people information that they often don't have when they come into this conversation. When we communicate as professionals with communities about housing, it's kind of often easy for us to forget that the vocabulary we use is not necessarily immediate to the people that we're trying to engage or to encourage, them to engage their residents. So we really always have to be clear about what we're talking about and introduce people to this vocabulary of housing so they can be fluent in it too, or help us perhaps think about more effective ways to say things that become sometimes a little bit too immediate for us. We also need to encourage people to really listen to the information about housing and housing stories that we have to share and our friends and neighbors have to share. And doing so means it's probably a good idea to kind of leave at the door any misconceptions that you may have so that you can really listen. It matters to find and welcome groups and organizations in our communities that are already attuned to housing problems and housing needs. And they're out there. There are faith communities, our schools, often our local businesses, healthcare providers, and others. But the last thing I kind of want to know before I move on, this is probably the slide I'll spend more time on than anything else in this presentation. Something I've kind of told my own municipal clients over 3 decades, and I think it's appropriate for this too. Whether the topic is housing or economic development or any other aspect of community planning, I think there are 4 things that local governments can bring to the table to help their communities be even better places to live and work. And those 4 tools that are unique to local government are given in the context of community planning is they can bring policy, they can bring regulation, they can bring capital investment and funding, and most importantly, they can bring leadership. And I think because housing is often such a challenging and contentious issue, it's important to build capacity among all those areas, but especially leadership. Something to keep in mind when you're talking about housing at the community level is that for many of us, it's about the ease of choice exists, but for many others, finding housing that's suitable and affordable is by chance. And part of what we're trying to do and address equitable housing is level that playing field a bit, so people have choices about where they want to live. Getting words right, there's very little in housing that sets off more of a firestorm than certain words. Affordable housing is one of them. I'm old enough to remember when affordable housing, the euphemism that's used in some places today, that became the way of not using the phrase low-income housing. And that goes back quite a ways. So that gives you a sense of how old I am. But affordable housing in my world, to me as a planner, regardless of what state I'm working in, it's available to people who want to rent or own on a fair and open basis. So people who want to choose to live in a community are able to access housing that's available to them, and there's no kind of discrimination involved for any reason. That the unit is safe. It's a safe place to live. It's a decent unit. It's appropriate for the size of a household. Sometimes in these planning exercises around housing, you'll hear a lot about the need for housing for young people entering the workforce, and that's very important. That kind of unit is one thing, but it's important to remember that households they really are the consumers of housing. So a family isn't necessarily the entity that needs a 1-bedroom unit or a studio. They need something else. The issue is, what is the mix of housing that's available in your community to serve many different types of household consumers? And of course, importantly, that the housing is relatively affordable. And I'm not talking about income restrictions right now. I'm just talking about wherever you are in life, in terms of the income available to your household, are you spending not more than roughly a third of your income on housing? And if that's kind of where you are, your home is probably affordable to you. The fact is that why we're talking about housing crisis in every state in the Northeast is that because for many people, they can't find housing that allows them to live at roughly 30% of their income for housing. Affordable housing may be financed with subsidies. It may have some restrictions. It may not. Or it may just be what we call naturally occurring, something that's affordable relative to prices or incomes in a particular community or region. Workforce housing is another term that sets people off. So there's this sort of technical definition, at least in New Hampshire terms, of 60% of area median income for renters or 100% for homeowners. But what it really means is that to recognize that most people who are making less than 60% of area median income are working. And they work at essential jobs that make our economies function, from a health aide to a school bus driver to a daycare worker to a farm worker or a cashier. And we need to not lose sight of those are essential workers, and they are the ones who are often the most priced out of housing in our communities. As a planner, I think about geographic connections about everything. That's a fundamental premise of planning. To me, workforce housing means housing that's near employment centers, that's affordable to people who have jobs there, whatever those jobs may be. A housing needs assessment, which has been a key part of the HOP grants in New Hampshire, is understanding those links between geography and wages and housing costs. And this is just a little bit of an example. This table may be hard to read, but if you just look at that far right column with the red numbers, that is how many hours per week at the minimum wage in New Hampshire people would have to work to afford a 2-bedroom a unit at sort of the fair market rent in the particular regions in your state. So 255 hours a week to live in close to the Boston area, 166 in the Lawrence catchment area, on up to 123 hours a week in Grafton County, and so on. So that's what it would take for someone, minimum wage, that they would have to work that many hours a week to afford a unit in that region. That's unaffordability, I think, by anybody's standard. What's underneath the opposition to housing is often the elephant in the room, and the elephant varies. It has a lot to do with the myth busting that we need to do as part of the community engagement process to help people understand that we all of us tend to bring certain ideas to the table about what we think about people based on what they look like, whether they are skinny, they are old, whatever, and sort of being able to demystify some of the things that people think is an important part of housing engagement and education. It's really hard to create housing. I have to underscore this. People think that just because developers make housing, they must make a lot of money and it must be really easy. And the reality is there is nothing as hard as building housing. Absolutely nothing. And the barriers range from government regulation, often at the local level, sometimes beyond the locality. Changes in federal policy that date back 40 odd years in my career, when the federal government essentially walked away from subsidizing or supporting the development of a wide variety of housing. Rules around mortgage lending make it hard. Social stratification. We have communities that are relatively wealthy and those that are not, and the stratification sets in and it becomes very hard to break down barriers. On one hand, to introduce affordability in communities that don't have it, and on the other hand, to introduce market rate housing in communities that need that. Gentrification is an issue in housing, and once that sets in some of our traditionally lower income small cities, or gateway cities as we sometimes call them, it becomes very difficult to continue to house the people who've historically lived there and never left. Speculation is another issue that happens in housing that can make it difficult to provide affordability. Myth and ideas about race and ethnicity. In my experience in planning over 30 years, those are probably the biggest barriers that make it so hard to talk about housing. And then social segregation as well. Sometimes we like to think of our communities as the last bastion of civility. My experience with town meetings is that sometimes they look like the image on the left, and sometimes they look like the image on the right. And often when we're talking about housing, it kind of breaks down. So getting people comfortable with talking about housing and not being angry about it is a big challenge in engagement. People talk about, in conversations about housing, overcrowded schools. You kind of alluded to that earlier when you talked about coming out with a study or information about school impacts. I have to tell you, I was a frequent provider of fiscal impact studies for communities up until about 6 months ago. I did them often. I have more data than you want to know. And I stopped doing them because it hit me. I had an epiphany one day. As a planner, I have an ethical obligation to do a variety of things, one of which is to recognize fairness and to uphold laws. And by engaging in the conversation about children in schools and having more families move into our communities, we're essentially giving lip service to the idea that it's okay to regulate based on family size. That is in direct contradiction to the Federal Fair Housing Act. And at some point, we all have to recognize that. Sometimes people will complain about a housing development because they walk their dogs there. Of course, it's not their land, but that's what's precious to them. And then the other thing we tend to hear is about traffic. So those three things tend to be the critical issues that come up in housing conversations, at least in my experience. Overcrowded schools, or we just don't want more kids in our schools, or we have great schools and everybody wants to live here and it's too much for us to afford. Our dogs walk there. We love our open space. And then traffic. Those are things that people tend to say. And it becomes challenging for people on a housing committee or a commission or a planning board trying to engage their community in fair conversations about housing to sort of move beyond those ideas. Another thing that people often say about affordable housing, oh, it's just social engineering. We're kind of giving away the store here for people who are poor and don't work enough or whatever. But the reality is that wealthy homeowners also have a subsidy in their world, and it's the tax deduction that comes from owning a home, which is very precious to people who own a house. I own a house, matters to me. But there's a recognition here that it's not just about direct cash subsidy that goes to affordable housing. There's a broader subsidy going on in our economy and our society that favors home ownership, which makes it hard to talk about rental housing. So what can cities and towns do? My experience is they can do a whole lot, and more than they probably realize. But in order to get there, people have to start with learning. Bless the Housing Academy for the work that you're doing to educate people about housing. People need to develop the capacity to lead. They need to think about engaging their faith communities because there's so much knowledge in those among those organizations about housing needs. Understanding the importance of advocacy. When people oppose a housing development, they will go to a public hearing in droves. You have to get the people there who also support so that the board that has to make a decision hears from them as well. And investing in community development. I often start on these projects, and we've done some of this, in Plymouth already. It's just challenging or encouraging people to think about what do you even know about the place you live? It's remarkable to me, and it shouldn't be, that sometimes people don't even know the population of their own community. Do you understand that there are housing cost differences between neighborhoods in your community? Are there stereotypes floating here? Who's leaving your community and why, and who's moving to your community? And these are all things that if people just stop and think about, well, what's changed in their own neighborhood? It begins to help them see what it is, the dynamics of change that's happening, and could they afford to buy the home that they live in today that they bought perhaps 25 or 30 years ago? You need all this information because you can't tell a story without it. Inspiring local action, it comes down to you, your family, your friends. Do you serve on a housing committee in your town or housing commission? If you don't, consider it. Compete for a seat on the planning board. If you haven't done that, consider it. Support zoning that encourages workforce housing. Participate in getting things organized in favor of housing in your community. The housing needs assessments are an important part of kind of being able to build on some information that helps you get to the question about regulatory development. But there are just these steps that are basic to any kind of community planning, and it's particularly important for housing. Understanding where you are, having reasonable goals, attainable goals, and working to get them with leadership, with funding, with regulation, with policy development. Understanding whether your town does your town have a local ordinance or bylaw or anything that affirms the community's commitment to housing, even a resolution. Do you have a zoning that encourages a variety of housing types? Do you have a fair housing action plan? That's often something that people don't really think about, but it's central to understanding and talking about housing in a way that's going to be productive. Do your planning board, your select board, or others, do they speak up about discriminatory comments made at public hearings? We all have an obligation to make sure that everyone's comfortable coming to a public meeting or a public engagement activity, not just people who are already in the mainstream in their communities. Has your town ever considered doing any kind of an equity analysis to look at the extent to which perhaps existing local regulations may impede the ability of people to choose to live in your community? Where's your city or town manager, your selectman? Does your master plan say anything about housing at all? And if it does, has the plan been implemented? Do your boards and committees communicate? This is often one of the challenges I find as a planner, especially working in small towns. Do people just don't have time to communicate? That makes it hard to move forward with a housing agenda. This is just an example of something we've done in a lot of communities we work in, and we're planning to do it in Plymouth as well, is to help people understand what are the jobs in your community right now and what are the wages for them. So this is just an example of a community where there happens to be quite a bit of hospitality and food service establishments. And so we did this sort of an info sheet, like there's always a seat at my table for you. Can I be your neighbor? So the question is just from the perspective of people working in the community, can I be your neighbor? Do you have people in your community who will talk at public hearings and city council meetings about the need for housing? Can you build that? Building that advocacy is very important. And I always just try to close with the question for people, does your town have room for me? That's really the question at hand. Does your town have room for me, whoever I am? think that's the end of my talk for now. Corinne, you're up.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. My name is Corinne Marcoux, as it was stated, and I work for the City of Keene. I've been here for about 14 plus years. And I work, as I said, in admin, but I also work as the zoning board clerk in our community development department. And I've been helping our planners, my fellow coworkers, on our housing needs analysis these past few months. And I am also a citizen of Fitzwilliam, and I am helping our navigator, housing navigator in Fitzwilliam as well. And so it's really interesting for me where in Keene, we're just wrapping up phase 2, but in Fitzwilliam, we're just beginning. So I'm taking a few of the lessons that we've learned in the past few months here in Keene, and hopefully going to use those in Fitzwilliam as well too. But to begin with, as you can see, we've worked with many entities within the city, beginning with, and most importantly, our city council and our subcommittees. This was mainly to introduce them to the consultants and to review the scope of work and provide them with a schedule of our project. During the whole process, consultants would periodically meet with the city to review data and data analysis, trends, key findings, and the such, and to answer, of course, any questions. At one point during these periodic meetings on April 10th, they gave an in-person presentation to the Joint Committee, our city council members and our planning board, on the draft proposed strategies that included a workshop component. After the consultants gave an overview and answered clarifying questions, which there were many, we divided the committee into 4 smaller groups of 3 to 4 people, each group. And we also asked audience members to join these groups as well. So it wouldn't just be staff, city volunteer staffs and such. And during these groups, we asked for them to dive deeper into the proposed strategies and ID which ones were a priority. The small groups had about 5 minutes for each of the 4 goal areas, and this generated a lot of great discussion and feedback. And this preliminary feedback was used to refine the housing strategies in our final report. But at the initial onset of this project, our department and the mayor assisted in gathering key stakeholders that we thought would be able to contribute vital information from these different sectors of our community. Our consultants interviewed developers, land use consultants, and those in low to moderate income housing sector during a pretty in-depth phone call that lasted about 45 minutes or so. And the next we conducted an open house and a community survey. Knowing that Southwest Regional Planning Commission had already done a survey the prior year, we reached out to them asking if they would share those responses, which were about 90. Rather than do the same survey again, we decided to build off of those results and focus mainly on housing resiliency, including topics like health and safety conditions, susceptibility to catastrophic events like floods and fires, and other elements that indicate vulnerabilities in our housing inventory here in Keene. This involved a great deal of outreach using social media, press releases, city and partner newsletters, posters and flyers, which we incorporated the QR code, which we identify as an easy use for people. Specifically, if they see a flyer somewhere, posted at a local business, which we did, they could quickly, easily take a snapshot of that QR code and do the survey. We also promoted it on our local radio station, and we promoted the survey at our housing workshop as well. Staff created and maintained a distinct website to house not only the survey link, but all our vital information on the project, including the housing needs analysis report. At the workshop, we were excited to announce that we had over, oh, I apologize, advanced fast, just too much. At the workshop, we were excited to announce that we had over 250 survey responses, which we thought was an incredibly good response rate for an online survey here in Keene. However, attendees of that workshop thought that number was low and criticized the city for not getting more people to respond. We took that opportunity to work with our critics and to listen to them and to ask everyone present at the workshop that were criticizing us to help, and those who weren't as well, to help us spread the survey, the news of, or the request of the survey, and ask them to share it with their networks. In the last 10 days of that survey, that the survey was opened, we garnered more than 100 additional responses for a total of 354 responses. So we look at that as the power of taking a negative, stopping and listening, and then turning it into a positive, something that we thought was pretty cool. During the initial outreach, we collaborated with our Public Works Department, who at the time was also beginning to outreach for a downtown infrastructure improvement project. Luckily for us, we began this process just before the holidays, and we were able to reach out to area events such as craft fairs, craft shows, and other events at the public library and such, where we asked people to sign up for updates to one or both of the projects, as well as provide the flyer with the survey information. Knowing that the value of social media, we created our next flyer to post. We printed some of these as well to distribute across the city, just to have a different visual for people to be to hopefully catch their eye as well. And we just, it was printed on regular paper with a larger QR code. When people were scrolling their feeds, this poster was prominent and to the point and eye-catching. We also asked the choir, our city councilors, our housing advocates, and our housing providers to share the post on their feeds to help with exposure as well. For our community workshop, we created a flyer for posting across town and again on our social media sites. With all the outreach flyers, posting communications, we took advantage of the city's new marketing initiative and used new key colors, which helped again catch the eye of our public. During the workshop, after a short presentation by our consultants and Q&A questions, we asked vital questions. During the workshop, after a short presentation by our consultants and Q&A session, we asked vital questions using a variety of of information gathering methods, such as dot voting, post-it notes. Staff mingled with the public in answering questions and listening to their concerns and issues and helping them to understand the process of the goal and the goals of the project. This was a good stepping stone in gathering information. We had a great presentation from the choir, and other stakeholder groups were missing entirely. One of my favorite questions we asked was this slide right here, with the visuals in the different color distinctions. It was again eye-catching, but it was a visual that was easier for folks to ponder before answering. We gave them examples to visualize in their neighborhood and in the city, ones that they may not have thought of before or even known before the workshop. Keene has a lot of single and multifamily homes, but we don't have many small cottage-sized homes, or even tiny homes. So I like this visual because it gave members of the public the opportunity to contemplate what this might look like in their home. Again, because they may not understand the terminology, this was able, they were able to have a visual to be able to help them understand. We also are working on, the City of Keene is also working on updating our ADU ordinance right now, and that's been sort of in the discussion with council and within the city. So this helped, this visual also helped individuals understand that. Lastly, we recently held an open house. I apologize, I'm just, we recently held an open house to share the housing study results, where we had 6 stations, and oops. We had our open house to share the housing study results, where we had, like I said, 6 stations, an intro station, 1 station per goal area, and a final station. At each of these goal area stations, we had info about the overall goal area and the proposed statistics. When asked people to use, then we asked people to use dot stickers, sticky notes to provide feedback on which group would be prioritized. At the final station, we asked people to fill out an online survey using a smartphone, and we provided 2 laptops for those who may not have had a smartphone. The results of this feedback will be compiled and then presented to City Council with a focus on the proposed strategies. From there, we expect the council to refer this to subcommittee, our Planning, License and Development Committee, for a recommendation. For then staff to again ask council to accept the report as informational. We tried hard to get the word out about this open house in the same manners as before, with social media, radio promotions and such. And actually one of my staff members is on the radio right now talking about this as well. So we also included these large posters, such as promoting the open house at area events, like our Keene Senior Center. We had a Women's Expo a few weeks ago, the public library, our food co-op, and we had a poster here in City Hall as well. We also asked to have it included in the Greater Monadnock Chamber of Commerce newsletter. And the turnout, we were, which was better than we expected. And we believe the time frame for the event helped as well, since we didn't run it at night, which we had done in the past, but this one was earlier in the evening, well, late afternoon, early evening. And we had just shy of 50 people that joined us in the first hour, which we thought was really, really good, really good. That's just a very quick overview of what the City of Keene has done. And if you have any questions.
Well, thank you so much to all of our presenters, George, Sarah, Judy, and Corinne. Now we do have some time for questions. Again, just a reminder, the meeting controls are located in the ribbon located at the top of your screen as depicted on the slide. There's an icon to raise your hand, to open the chat box and to react, as well as to change the screen view. So if you have a question, you can put it in the chat box and or raise your hand, and our speakers will then go ahead and do their best to answer them. Do we have any questions for any of our speakers? Give folks a minute. All right, as folks are kind of getting their questions together, I have a question. Really for any of you, for communities, any folks on this call that may be from communities that are kind of might be reluctant to kind of dip their toes into the water of kind of making changes to kind of be more inviting housing due to kind of for all the reasons we've highlighted. Do any of you have any kind of suggestions for kind of how to kind of overcome kind of maybe some of that initial resistance to kind of dipping your toes in the water, that kind of initial barrier, and kind of any kind of, especially any kind of, I know we're still early in the HOP grant program, but any kind of lessons learned in that process from Housing Academy?
See, when four people all want to say something, no one's going to say anything. I think that others may have more experience, but I'm going to say one of the things about this toe in the water thing is that I think it gets back to the challenge of, do I think there's a problem with housing in my community and I want to change it right now and allow, half-acre zoning and multifamily on every single family residentially zoned lot, and let's make this happen. And all of a sudden, people are scattering because we need it for our workforce for affordable housing. The thing that I'm just about how do we talk about housing is, doesn't it start with maybe a question or a concern? And I think that it'd be good. And when Sarah is talking about housing committees and commissions, like, are there a few of us that say like there's a concern in our community, and how do we just talk about it from an inquisitive perspective? I'm reminded of a couple of places, Peterborough being one, where people in a room, they had already kind of gone down a road and were kind of backing up a little bit and regrouping. And the thing was, and actually Judy said this, what is my housing story? Like, what's it like for me and my family? And and get that out and share that, housing is important to me. It's one part of of many elements in a community and in a region. But how do we talk about it from an I perspective? And I think that that is a safe place if it's done right. That's where we talk a lot about these engagement things. Like, how do we glean some of that interest and what can come from thoughtfully listening, taking that in and saying, okay, what is this informing us about, and where do we go from here? And as someone's asking, is outreach ongoing? Well, this is always an iterative process with endless but important feedback loops, because there's always more people that we can reach. So that's my 2 cents worth.
Great. I think that was a really good summary. I think I'd add, like, the challenge with this work, I think, for a lot of people is that it's hard to sustain because, and I'm sure all of you on the call know this, that it takes forever and that there's often setbacks. So maybe you make a little progress and then you take a big step back, and maybe you make a little progress and you take a big step back. And so it is about having these conversations and this community engagement be sort of sustained indefinitely. That's part of the reason why we are so excited about housing commissions and committees and task forces, and we don't care what you call them, as long as your community has a group who's sort of sustaining and steering and making sure that this conversation keeps going. Sorry, forever. So I dropped a link to our guide, How Do We Talk About Housing? Because the first step of this, and we really emphasize in this guide, the role of relationship building and specifically encouraging folks to start the conversation from a place of curiosity, to be inquisitive and to ask a lot of questions. And we always discourage communities from leading with solutions, because solutions as a starting point are absolutely, like, terrifying to a lot of people in a lot of ways. And so starting with, like, what is your housing story? What are people talking about in this community? Like, who's not here, who's missing from these conversations? And really going and building from there as you sort of build your coalition, build your coalition of people who are willing to move this conversation forward. I don't know, Corinne and Judy, if you want to add anything to that.
Judy, it looks like you might want to trying to say something, but are on mute.
Sorry, I thought I was on mute again. I think the importance of building a core group that is really becomes passionate about this through perhaps some initial effort around housing, enabling an advocacy group to kind of keep going, and to recognize opportunities to perhaps do something they hadn't planned on initially, but it becomes an opportunity and you seize it. Because sometimes the thing that you most need to do is just not going to happen in year 1 or year 2 or year 3. So it's getting the folks together. And I don't really care how small the group is. If it's a group that didn't exist 3 years ago that now is able to go to a town meeting or look at a warrant and just say, well, what's on here about housing? I ought to be there to get information to show up at public hearings about proposed housing developments. If you can get that core going, you're way ahead of the game. Leadership building. I just say this over and over again. It's about leadership building.
Great.
And one of the things that jumped out to me from Corinne's presentation and too, and what's happening in Keene was sort of the mix of stakeholders that are being involved and included. Like we talk about like doing key informant interviews. So like find a person who's like a stakeholder in this community, whether it's like somebody from the, maybe it's an elected leader, maybe it's a business owner, maybe it's somebody from like a faith-based organization. Build those relationships and bring those people together because they're all really important stakeholders who have sort of a different perspective or idea about what's happening in the community.
And I would make sure that your renters are included, and that can be a very difficult population to reach. But if you're not hearing the story of the renters, then not really hearing the whole housing story.
Absolutely.
That's a unique
Absolutely.
perspective.
Absolutely. I see one of the questions is any particular advice for folks in small rural towns trying to promote affordable housing. That can be really difficult. One of the issues that we're coming up with, or one of the major roadblocks that we found in Fitzwilliam is, many of us are on our own well and septic. And I am very interested in that conference that's coming up in Lee that you mentioned, George. So that is a real concern. How can you build affordable housing and promote that, as well as you have the transportation issue as well. Small rural towns don't have the industry that, say, Manchester, Portsmouth, Keene has. So how are you going to also have transportation for individuals to be able to get to jobs and back home again in an affordable house? So those are issues that we're dealing with in Fitzwilliam that we're coming across, and they're valid. Leadership, again, it's an issue that we have. It's again a roadblock that we have in Fitzwilliam. It's a roadblock that we have here in Keene as well. It seems like you have the same volunteers that come out for zoning board, planning board, the other commissions that participate in the surveys, and it's that struggle of trying to find more individuals within the community who want to become involved, who want to pay attention to what's happening, and who have the bandwidth to be able to pay attention. So life is hard right now. We all know that. And to be able to immerse yourself in a community and the governance of that community, along with trying to keep that roof over your head and food on the table, can be really daunting.
Yeah. Yeah. I was pleased to see this question about rurality because I like working with New Hampshire's bigger communities, but I love working with New Hampshire's smaller communities. Those small rural communities where the challenge really is real to figure out how to do this, like this question of water and sewer, this question of like rural character and what does that mean and what fits into your community. I think part of what I like about this is that we kind of have this idea, and one of the myths in our myth busting series will speak to this, that like workforce housing is like big, gigantic apartment buildings and it only fits into these specific communities. But we know that that's not all that workforce housing is. And we take a very sort of custom tailored approach to every community. Like a solution that works in Manchester is not going to be the same solution that works in Fitzwilliam. And so we talk about like, how do we customize that solution for that small community and my advice would be to start really small. Like we're not talking about, let's not start with like inclusionary zoning. Let's not start with multifamily housing when we're talking about Fitzwilliam. Let's start with like, let's talk about your ADU ordinance. Let's talk about like, do you allow a single family house to be converted to a duplex? Like, let's get really small and just take those little baby steps and allow for incremental development. So we're still talking about housing, but we're talking about housing that's contextually appropriate for that community. It fits in, it blends in, and it works there. And people are going to be happy to see that little bit of like gentle density, that little bit of sort of increased density that's not scary and won't hurt the rural character. And it's not a Manchester solution in a teeny community. So.
And in that context, it's something that's circling back to what you've discerned is the needs of people that are there and that you want there and maybe aren't currently. And that's why, Brewster's question, promoting affordable housing. I don't think I want to promote affordable housing. I want to promote housing diversity for people like Jack, Mary, Scott, my neighbor's grandmother that needs care. I mean, that's who I want. John and Maggie, this morning we're talking about, they're the people that are living in they're going to be living in their 44 unit thing in Dover. And, it's like the question is like, are those people going to need services? No, they're providing services. And it's like, there's so much that we may not be thinking about when we're thinking about the human nature of it. We funded a Housing Stories initiative, which was nothing more than interviewing people that you could identify with. They're saying, yeah, I'm a junior commercial lender in a small bank. I'm renting. I'd love to put down roots. I love this town, but I can't afford a $500,000 house. It's like, that's very real. And we can get behind that person perhaps and think about, well, how do we allow that? Well, what's getting in the way? And that it becomes organic and human fueled rather than data and solutions fueled.
Great. And I want to make sure I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. I was just gonna say what we're seeing in Fitzwilliam along those lines, George, is that we have young adults who would like to stay in town, but there isn't any housing. And again, same thing where we have older population who would like to stay in their own home that may not be able to, but would also not want to have to move to Keene into housing for them. They would rather stay in town because they've always lived in town. They've always lived in a small town. They consider Keene the big city and they don't want to come into, so they have that, small town dynamic and they want that. And I think it was in Portsmouth, there's a project that happened recently, a development that happened recently where it was a sort of like a cul-de-sac of small homes, tiny homes. And I could see that in Fitzwilliam. Small cluster of small homes, 500-700 square feet, small little cluster of them. And that could be a solution for first-time homeowners who want to stay in town, who, those young adults that don't want to move out, that want to stay in that small rural town.
Yeah, and I love that because that's human-centered. And again, this is the challenge of calling something workforce, because what if that's a retired person? The solution for someone in the workforce and a retired person or a person wants to age in community could be one and the same. We need to hear it that way and expressed. So great points.
I'm listening to all of this, and I have to tell you, I was flashing back 60 years of my life. So I grew up in Hancock, and my dad owned the store on Main Street, and I spent the first 4 years of my life above that store. And we finally moved out to a single-family home that my dad and a friend of his built. But on Main Street in Hancock, when I was a kid, I'm just picturing this now, we had 5 homes that were either multifamily or a duplex. Someone lived downstairs, rented out the upstairs. There were 5 structures where there was rental housing just seamlessly mixed in with home ownership. And that was just part of what it was to live there. What I see today is that there's been a real shift in thinking about what a renter is and what renters bring or take from our communities. But that sense of we're just all like part of this town and we all walk down the street and go to the congregational church together, we've lost some of that. And I think part of what we really are talking about in getting communities to think about housing is how do you make this a place where it's okay to be different? And it's okay to bring different experiences and different incomes and different beliefs and different skin color and all of those things that kind of make a place a real community, a place that people can call home. Do you have room for me in your community? We did. And I think we're all at one level or another trying to make places where anybody can call that town or that city their home because it has room for them.
That reminds me of one of the first initial sessions in the Housing Academy talked about story, just like you stated, your story. And it made me think about mine. Both of my parents, originally from Northern New Hampshire, very French Canadian. Both of my parents immigrated here from Canada, and both of them came here, bought land, were able to build a house and raise their family and live a life.
Yep.
Now, for someone, my kids who are with the age that my grandparents were when they came here, my son is still living with me because he can't afford to live on his own. It works out great for both of us, but he can't live out on his own. He can't move out because it's so expensive, and he doesn't have, he wouldn't have the capability of living a life if he lived on his own, because his life would be working to sustain just his housing.
Yeah.
Because it's so expensive and it's just so outrageous right now. And it's difficult. It's difficult to find affordable housing that is a decent, well-maintained property. And listening to that one session in the Housing Academy, it really hit home for me that life, like you said, Judy, it is so changed from where it was when you and I, or even, our grandparents, when they came here, when they first started out on their lives, compared to what it is now for young adults, and even at any age range, but specifically for young adults.
Great. I didn't want to, we have a few minutes left. I didn't want to lose sight of Dave Nelson's question. Is there an element of the decline of social capital involved? In other words, changing the lower valuation of community by its residents? I think this goes back to Corinne, what you were just saying, and Judy, what you were saying about your experience growing up to Hancock versus now.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody wants to chime in on.
We started to sort of walk into that question on our own. I was noticing that through both of your housing stories. It's fantastic. And yes, there is some element of a decline of social capital involved in these conversations, and what does community mean? And I think there's a lot of conversation about sort of the difference between the, so like I am a younger person still, I think. And I bought my first home in 2020. I got lucky in some ways that I bought when I did. I got a great interest rate, right? But it was also a terrible time to buy a house. Maybe better than right now, but worse than lots of other times. And my husband and I truly, we bought a home because we wanted to start a family. And when we started looking, it's a lot of heartbreak. It's a lot of rejection. There weren't that many homes to choose from in the first place. And so we talk a lot about affordability, and I sometimes can't believe that I say this, but sometimes to some extent, affordability is irrelevant. It doesn't matter what you can afford. It doesn't matter how much money you have. There just isn't anything out there to choose from. And so, and looking for homes and putting in offers, and we got a lot of rejections, and that was a huge bummer. And the house that we ended up in, the seller who chose us told us that she chose us because of the letter that we sent. I mean, we also offered over asking and waived our inspection, which is just a terrible thing that home buyers have to do now. But it was because of the letter that we submitted. And I felt sort of defeated and sad when I wrote it. So good, I'm glad that it worked. But it is a really just challenging time to buy a home, to build community, to feel like you can put down roots and actually stay. If we had another kid and we wanted to be able to move into a larger home, would we be able to stay in the same community? The answer is truly I don't know. I don't even know if we could have another kid and buy a bigger home, because I just don't know that we can afford that in this sort of current world of the economy that we live in right now. And so there is some element of the decline of social capital, some element of what do we think about when we think about community now, and how has that changed over time? And I hope, Dave, that sort of speaks to your question a little bit. And for the record, when I did buy my home, which was under the workforce housing purchase limit, counts toward my community's fair share of workforce housing. Nobody ever called it workforce housing. It's just a regular person, like my husband and I, married couple, young, we were both in our 30s at the time, like wanting to buy a home, our first home, so that we could have a baby and have some space to like grow a family into. Nobody ever called it workforce housing. There was no like special label on it. There was no like special income verification I needed to do. It was just a house that happened to be affordable to two people who were both sort of working and part of the community and volunteering our time and again, sort of being part of the community and the community that we value and wanted to be part of. So I'd love to see more of that, you know.
It's so great the way you tie that back in, and you know, late at night you may not know, but there's a big neon sign that says workforce housing on your house. You just don't see it. I know that we're out of time. I did want to say one more thing about social capital, and I think that as we learn through Housing Academy and with technology, you know, it's easy to sort of get input through Facebook and other things, but I think sometimes, and we're probably seeing, that's probably part of the problem. And I think
Yeah.
what I've known social capital, it's like it's the human connection. It's kind of, and call me old school, but I think people act differently when they're in a room together, and that investment I think is important. And Housing Academy tries to promote, as challenging as that is, trying to be as face to face as possible, because people might be more respectful, more understanding, and that is the hope anyway, if done well.
Well, I'm going to thank all of our speakers, George, Sarah, Judy, and Corinne. This was great. I just put a link to the chat, in the chat to our anonymous evaluation form. You're welcome to either fill that out now after the session during your lunch break, or fill it out at the end of the day, at the end of the conference today. The slides for the sessions, as I put in earlier, are all available for viewing and download on OPD's conference website. I will put that in the chat once again now for folks. I also wanted to put in a plug before we break for this afternoon session on, so our first session after lunch will be how much housing does New Hampshire need at 12:45. Will be an overview of the state housing needs and regional housing need assessment. And in our second session at let's see, 2:15 will be about the New Hampshire Housing Toolbox. So getting back to some of what we were just talking about here about different solutions, not leading with solutions, but different strategies and solutions that communities of all shapes and sizes can think about for how to address the housing shortage in New Hampshire. So thanks again. We'll be sending out a follow-up email with links to the recordings for this session and all sessions sometime next week. And we hope you all enjoy your lunch break. We'll see you back here for anybody that wants to stay here for the housing track sessions this afternoon. You're also more than welcome to switch to any of the other track sessions. Will resume again at 12:45. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Noah.
Thank you.